All right, we're going to get going here. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the early session. If you were looking to attend the permit streamlining training for EV charging stations, you're at the right place. My name is Carl Epic. I'm with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission in Manchester, New Hampshire. We're hosting this webinar along with Jess Wilcox from the Department of Environmental Services here in New Hampshire. She's the coordinator of the Granite State Clean Cities Coalition. Real quickly, I think everybody probably knows how to do these Zooms. Couple features we're going to have today is one, the ability to raise hands and ask questions. Please do so at opportune times when trying to keep the flow going. There will be 4 polling questions as well. One here at the beginning after the introduction that Jess does, and then there'll be 2 or 3 throughout the rest of the presentation. I think this is going to go about an hour, Jess. How long, roughly?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Hour and a half.
Hour and a half.
Till 9. Yeah, we have it booked for till 9:30. Yeah.
So I'm going to let Jess Wilcox do the rest of the introduction, introduce our speakers, and go over more of the presentation. But I'll be handling any of the technical aspects. So just raise your hand, use the chat box if you need to communicate anything to me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carl. I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see that okay? Great. So thank you and welcome to this permit streamlining training for electric vehicle charging stations, which will highlight important actions that you can take to position your community for electric vehicle infrastructure investments. So I'm Jessica Wilcox. I'm the grants manager in the Air Resources Division at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, or DES. And I'm also the coordinator for the Granite State Clean Cities Coalition, which is a program hosted by DES. So as Carl mentioned, we want to make sure that the audio is muted for everyone and video is off so that we can focus on our presenters today. And as we mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and we hope to share it as well. If you have any questions, I do want to just point out that there is a Q&A feature, and if you could feel free to enter questions as we go, but I would just ask that you please identify the panelist that your question is for. It just makes it a lot easier at the end if we know who your question is directed to. And certainly if you have any comments or want to add any interesting resources or anything, feel free to use that chat feature. So who do we have with us today? We have Barry Woods. He's the Director of Electric Vehicle Innovation for Revision Energy. Barry provides sales, marketing, and business development expertise to assist companies and consumers in making the right decisions when it comes to charging infrastructure and related energy technology. Revision is a B-certified corporation and 100% employee-owned entity that to date has installed hundreds of level 2 EV chargers and over 30 large DC fast chargers at sites throughout New England, resulting from their diverse partnerships with ChargePoint, Greenlots, EVgo, Flow, and Tesla. Barry is also on the board of Plug in America, the only independent US-based nonprofit who is the voice for EV drivers. We also have Brian Morris, a senior business analyst in the Clean Energy Strategy and Policy Group at Eversource. His team is responsible for driving the company's electric vehicle programs and initiatives across its service territories in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. In this role, Brian partners with state agencies, regulators, and other stakeholders to develop EV charging infrastructure programs that help to accelerate the deployment of charging stations throughout our region. So thank you guys for the good work you're doing. And here, Barry, I'd like to turn it over to you to give us a little bit of background about you and your work.
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate everybody's early morning interest in this topic. It's a pleasure to get a chance to share some of the knowledge that we've acquired to date. This is just a slide showing some of the projects that we've been engaged in, including City Hall for Portland on the left. And then the second from left are some DC fast chargers that we worked on with ChargePoint as part of Maine's BW DC fast charging corridor. We did about 6 of those projects along the turnpike and various other locations. And then we we also did some DC fast chargers with Hannaford Brothers as part of EVgo and Nissan's no charge to charge program. And lastly is a slide that shows a bunch of chargers at LL Bean that we did. New Hampshire's been a little bit slow, but that's okay. You guys are going to catch up, and that's why this is a really important prep talk for you. I think just the other thing I would mention is, you know, we've done a lot of, obviously we've done a lot of commercial, we do a lot of residential. We're going to focus on commercial, and I was just going to give you a little sense of the scale here cost-wise. You know, the installation costs are pretty much the same, depending on whether it's basic charging or smart charging technology that you choose. And what we find is a common number is about 40 amp ports, particularly for a lot of the utility programs. And those installations either are going to be upgrading existing electrical or may require new service, because you're still looking at probably about a 200 amp panel minimum for that level of number of ports. So the pricing on those can vary from, I'd say, 10 to over 20,000 just on the installation side. And obviously when you're talking about 3-phase power for the DC fast charging, it's even more than that. The hardware costs are going to be anywhere from, you know, for 4 ports, I'd say 3,000 all the way up to, you know, in the 20s for the smart charging networks with all of their operational and extended warranty products attached. So that's just try to give you sort of a sense of the project scale. With that, I'll turn it back to Jess. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Barry. So here we'd like to go ahead and launch our first poll, as Carl mentioned. Here we'd like to know who we have with us today. Everyone, please let us know your affiliation by responding to the Zoom poll on your screen. We'll give everybody a few minutes with that. Carl, maybe 30 seconds to let everybody respond.
All right, we got 20 of 24. There's 4 people who haven't done it. 21. Last chance for polling. All right. I'm going to end it here. Share results. Can everybody see that?
Awesome. Yes. Great. We've got 43% with code enforcement officials. Thank you guys so much for joining. I know that there was a annual meeting this morning, and that was moved to allow for everyone to participate. So I appreciate that. Great turnout there. Welcome to the electric wiring and building inspectors, municipal staff. It's great. RPC members, thank you, and energy and sustainability committees. And those other, I know, includes me. So everybody, thank you so much, as Barry mentioned, for joining us early this morning. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. It's just a little bit of an agenda overview here. I'm going to begin with an introduction to our coalition, Granite State Clean Cities, provide some overviews of electric vehicles and charging stations, some considerations for you to strategically position your community as an EV hotspot, and some best practices and considerations for streamlining the permitting process for charging stations. Now, before I begin, I do want to clarify a couple of acronyms that you're going to hear used throughout this presentation and likely the other presentations. I may alternate between using the term electric vehicles and the acronym EVs, and between EV charging stations, also known as electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE. So let's begin. Granite State Clean Cities Coalition, or GSCCC, is part of a nationwide network of nearly 100 Clean Cities coalitions supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, or the DOE. We work with vehicle fleets, businesses, and municipalities to reduce petroleum use in transportation through the advancement of alternative fuels, vehicles, and technologies, and also through fuel efficiency strategies such as idle reduction. Now, alternative fuel vehicles are vehicles fueled by something other than gasoline or diesel. So think like natural gas, propane, biodiesel. And this does include electric vehicles. We are fuel agnostic and technology neutral. And on-the-ground Clean Cities coordinators like me serve as educators and problem solvers for our stakeholders. In New Hampshire, our coalition is made up of over 140 stakeholders. These consist of public and private fleets, such as state, municipal, utilities, and fuel and beverage supply companies, businesses such as fuel providers and vehicle manufacturers, and municipalities such as schools and universities, regional planning commissions, and energy and sustainability committees. So all of these stakeholders, or partners as I prefer to call them, since there are no fees or member dues to join our coalition, all of them are working in support of our mission to improve air quality and foster economic development in New Hampshire's transportation sector. And we do this through collaborative partnerships and projects that promote petroleum reduction strategies. Now, since inception in 1993, Clean Cities Coalition projects have achieved a cumulative impact in energy use equal to nearly 10 billion gasoline gallon equivalents. This infographic reflects some pretty substantial coalition impacts, such as 1 million alternative fuel vehicles on the road. Now, GSCCC does contribute to this impact. Each year, we collect data from our stakeholders for an annual report. In 2019, New Hampshire stakeholder efforts reduced 1.3 million gasoline gallon equivalents and 8,200 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So not just a drop in the barrel. So we promote alternative fuel successes and solutions through education and outreach, such as stakeholder meetings and events like our coalition's biennial Green Your Fleet workshop at the New Hampshire Motor Speedway, which you can see in the top right photo. And the photo to the left of that shows last September's bi-state EV connector at Hypertherm in Lebanon, New Hampshire. So GSCCC partners are putting the rubber to the road using propane school buses, shown in the bottom right photo, compressed natural gas or CNG, and hybrid electric transit buses, which you can see in the top left photo, or even using biodiesel, which is really a drop in fuel in their diesel dump trucks and pickup trucks. DOE offers resources that can help you do the same. Our go-to website is the Alternative Fuels Data Center, where you can find details about each fuel, including basic information, publications and case studies, laws and incentives, fuel pricing on a local, regional, and national level, and other tools. For example, if you want to know what vehicle manufacturers are offering electric refuse trucks, check out the vehicle search tool. We also have access to technical and problem-solving assistance and experts, not just within our own coalition, which has a lot of great expertise, but the DOE also offers a technical response service for rapid response to alternative fuel questions, and then on a larger scale, Tiger teams for technical problem solving related to actual vehicle deployment and infrastructure development. So as you can see, we have a lot to offer. And if you're interested in being added to our mailing list for our biennial newsletters, or even just joining our coalition to kind of keep in touch and support our efforts, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to get you connected. Now let's talk about electric vehicles. Why the focus on EVs? The simple truth is that electric technology is more efficient for moving cars around, and it's getting better every day. According to fueleconomy.gov, EVs convert over 77% of the electrical energy that they get from the grid to power at the wheels. Conventional gasoline vehicles only convert about 12 to 30% of that energy stored in gasoline to turning the wheels. Now, there are two types of electric vehicles that use an external power source to charge an onboard battery: battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, or PHEVs. Both BEVs and PHEVs, which we collectively refer to as plug-in hybrid or plug-in electric vehicles, or PEVs, all use electricity to charge or fuel their batteries. Now, I've mentioned the two types of electric vehicles, but I kind of want to highlight the differences. Battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, are pure electric, powered only by one or more electric motors. Now, they can only go as far as their battery charge will allow them, which is why charging stations are so important. We've gone from having only a few EV models to a few dozen, with ranges from about 80 miles to 370. PHEVs, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, are much like regular hybrid vehicles in that they have both an electric motor and a gas engine. But unlike regular hybrids, they can be plugged in to charge and can run 10 to 15 miles just on electric. When that battery charge runs out, the gas engine seamlessly kicks in, keeping that vehicle running. Now, DES has 3 Toyota Prius Prime PHEVs, and the last time I looked, we were getting over 70 miles per gallon, so pretty good. So let's amp it up and talk about positioning your community as an EV hotspot. Vehicle electrification is transforming transportation. Today, electric vehicles are in our fleets and on our roads. It's no longer the future. Electric vehicles offer benefits both to the environment and to the consumer. Because they have no tailpipe emissions when running on electricity, and even when including power plant emissions, EVs reduce pollutants such as nitrogen oxides or NOx. Over half of the pollutants that cause summertime smog and poor air quality days is NOx emissions from cars and trucks. Additionally, EVs emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions or GHGs than gasoline-powered vehicles. And the GHG reductions from EVs will become even greater as a higher portion of electricity is produced by renewable resources. Now, New Hampshire has a relatively clean electricity mix thanks to our participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And this is why transportation electrification is a key strategy for achieving air quality and climate goals and for integrating renewable energy in the transportation sector. Now, in addition to environmental benefits, EVs are fun to drive. EV capability and technology is rapidly progressing, and people are excited about it. On average, thanks to fuel and maintenance savings, it costs about half as much to drive an EV compared to a similar vehicle that runs on gasoline. EVs have fewer moving parts compared to conventional vehicles, which means no oil changes, no spark plugs, no fuel or emissions components. And according to a recent consumer report, EV and plug-in hybrid drivers can expect to save an average of $4,600 in repair and maintenance costs over the life of the vehicle. Now, the U.S. Department of Energy's e-gallon tool shows that it costs $1.67 per gasoline gallon equivalent to fuel an EV in New Hampshire versus $2.12 per gallon to fuel with gasoline. What's more, the cost of EV batteries has decreased from over $1,100 per kilowatt hour in 2010 to just $156 per kilowatt hour in 2019. So as this continues to fall, the price of EVs will also come down. Electric vehicles are a fast-growing market. There are over 1.6 million EVs on the road in the U.S. today, and this number will continue to rise as more charging infrastructure is deployed, as the cost of EVs decreases, as the range of the vehicles increases, and consumers become increasingly aware of the benefits of driving electric. Now, some forecasts indicate that 20% of new cars sold will be electric by 2030. That would result in over 18 million EVs on the road in that year. That would project indeed for about 9 million charging stations to support them. In New Hampshire, annual EV registration totals increased 28% from 2018 to 2019, most noticeably in Hillsborough and Rockingham counties. With many new models and a variety of different body types coming out, along with these longer ranges and falling purchase prices, the rate of EV adoption in New Hampshire is expected to increase. And consumer acceptance will also continue to grow as new and diverse models are introduced. Now, currently there are over 40 different models of electric cars available for sale in the US, including sports cars, sedans, SUVs, and minivans. Most major vehicle manufacturers have invested significantly in electrification and have announced that exciting new products are on the way, including more EVs with four-wheel drive, longer ranges, and as we were talking about earlier, electric pickup trucks. So some exciting stuff on the horizon here. The market is growing, and as we look ahead, fuel and technology diversification is going to be integral to meeting our goals. Companies like Automakers, Motive Power Systems, and XL Fleet, which is headquartered right over the border in Massachusetts, work with automakers like Ford Motor Company to integrate plug-in hybrid upfits and zero-emissions electric drivetrains and propulsion systems in some of the familiar and favorite commercial fleet vehicles, like step vans, work trucks, etc. Hino, which is a Toyota subsidiary offering diesel-electric hybrid trucks, recently introduced a line of zero-emissions Class 4 to Class 8. And I believe we're going to see a lot more of this, with California's recent mandate requiring all new medium and heavy duty vehicles to be zero emissions vehicles by 2045. Electric is also a great option in other applications like refuse trucks, forklifts, street sweepers, and commercial lawn equipment. Now, in fact, we're partnering with Vermont Clean Cities to offer a virtual lunch and learn highlighting electric lawn equipment next Wednesday, the 16th at 11:30 a.m. So please, send me an email if you'd like the registration link. I can hook you up. And on the larger end, electric transit and school buses and long-haul trucks. Electric bus manufacturers like Lion Electric, New Flyer, and BAE Systems, which has a presence in New Hampshire, are all working with communities to deploy electric buses. Now, in the last photo at the bottom right here, you're going to see Nashua Transit, which held a ribbon cutting just last year for 2 new hybrid electric transit buses, which were equipped with BAE Systems hybrid drive propulsion systems. So electric vehicles need to be charged with electricity to fuel their batteries. Now, while studies show that 80% of charging happens at home, public charging plays a vital role in driving EV adoption. Charging stations, also referred to as electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE, connect the electric vehicle to the electric grid, and currently there are 3 different levels. Level 1 AC charging consists of plugging the cord that comes with the car into a standard 3-prong household plug, which is at 120 volt AC wall outlet. So just like plugging in your toaster. This is best suited for home and workplace charging and provides 2 to 5 miles of range per hour of charging. And that depends on the size of the battery. Now, since most, if not all EVs come with a level 1 charging cord, no additional charging equipment is necessary. Level 2 AC charging requires a 240 volt outlet, which is the same kind used by a clothes dryer or an electric stove. This is mostly used in home, workplace, fleet, and public facilities and provides approximately 10 to 25 miles of range per hour of charging. And DC fast charging. This requires a 3-phase 480 volt AC electric circuit and delivers a significantly faster charge. Most existing DC fast charging stations are 50 kilowatts, delivering 60 to 80 miles of range in 20 minutes. These are used primarily to charge battery electric vehicles. However, there are now much faster DC fast charging stations, including ones that deliver up to 350 kilowatts, a wattage capable of delivering 200 miles of range in 10 minutes. And these are mainly located in high traffic transportation corridors or public fueling stations. Now, for all levels of charging, it is important to note that no electricity flows from the charger until it's securely plugged into the vehicle, and that the EVSE then communicates with the vehicle to deliver a safe flow of electricity. So unlike level 1 and level 2 charging, there are also different types of connector plugs for DC fast chargers. Now, there are currently 3 different DC fast charging plug types that are associated with different automobile manufacturers. Tesla uses its own proprietary plug that can only be used to charge Tesla vehicles. And European and American car manufacturers like BMW, GM, and Volkswagen typically use the SAE Combined Charging System, or CCS plug. Lastly, Asian car manufacturers like Nissan and Mitsubishi use the CHAdeMO plug. Now, except for Tesla stations, many new DC fast charging stations come equipped with both CCS and CHAdeMO plugs. No matter which connector is used, it's important to note that DC fast charging is a safe technology that's built to code and follows rigorous safety standards. Now, DC fast charging stations are an essential component of the EV charging ecosystem. While it's generally understood that DC fast charging is needed to facilitate long distance travel, there are many DC fast charging applications for local EV drivers as well. DC fast charging stations provide a viable charging option for people without the ability to charge at home, such as those living in apartment buildings, and are also used by EV drivers looking to top off. As you can see from this image, New Hampshire communities have permitted a few DC fast charging stations already. This map shows 13, with only 6 being universally accessible. But look at all the communities that still need charging. We need to support this growing industry. In fact, the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, has designated national EV charging and other alternative fueling corridors in strategic locations along major highways and roadways to improve the mobility of alternative fuel vehicles. To designate these corridors, DOT solicits nominations from states, and we here in New Hampshire do participate in this program. New Hampshire's principal highways were evaluated against federally set criteria and designated as either corridor ready or corridor pending. For example, an electric vehicle or EV-ready corridor is a highway or section of a highway that has DC fast charging every 50 miles and no farther than 5 miles from the highway. The picture on this slide reflects New Hampshire's EV corridors. We have some that are EV-ready, for example, a portion of the F.E. Everett Turnpike, which are denoted by the solid green lines, and some that are pending, for example, I-89 from Lebanon to Concord, which are the dotted orange lines. Additionally, we work with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation to finalize a corridor signage plan. Signs have been manufactured and installation has begun with EV signage on I-93 and I-95. This is a great way to promote the existence of accessible charging. So you can see a picture of some of the signage there on the right. It's important that we strive to move our pending corridors to ready to support EV travel and to further adoption and awareness. So if you're working on any EV charging projects in your community, these designations should serve as a guide for identifying and prioritizing sites that support these corridors. Now, as you might already know, New Hampshire is receiving approximately $31 million from the Volkswagen settlement, and Governor Sununu has committed the full 15%, or approximately $4.6 million, which is the maximum allowed under the settlement, to be used for EV charging stations. And DES is working with the lead agency, the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives, and last November, a DC fast charging request for proposals for approximately $2 million was released, seeking a network of EVSE on 6 of our FHWA designated corridors. Unfortunately, none of the proposals submitted met the minimum requirements of the RFP. So feedback on the appropriate design of a DC fast charging RFP was solicited through an RFI and a public listening session. And this RFP is being modified for re-release, further necessitating the timely need for permit streamlining because it's coming. So if your community is located near a principal travel route on this map, chances are that you're going to be permitting DC fast charging at some point in the very near future. Per the DOE's Alternative Fuel Data Center Station Locator tool, which is a tool supported by Clean Cities coordinators, in New Hampshire, there are 94 publicly accessible universal level 2 charging stations with 157 outlets. 112 stations, if you count Tesla, which, as I mentioned before, can only charge Tesla. Now, states all around us have adopted California's zero emissions vehicle mandate, challenging automakers to work harder to get competitive EVs to the market. In fact, Massachusetts projects to have 300,000 EVs on their roads by 2025. To prepare for this, they're building up their infrastructure, as noted in this slide, of the surrounding states in Canada. Now, New Hampshire's existing infrastructure is not sufficient to meet the need, both for EV drivers traveling in and around New Hampshire and for those visiting from out of state. We're working at the state level to fill the gaps, but the fact that there are gaps presents both a challenge and an opportunity for municipalities. You have the ability to simplify planning by implementing policies and processes that facilitate EV readiness. With the anticipated growth of EVs, the integration of EVSE should be incorporated in municipal planning and preparation. Public Level 2 EVSE offers many possibilities for municipalities. The cost of Level 2 equipment and installation can range from $1,000 to $20,000, depending on the location and whether or not there are existing circuits. When compared to DC fast charging costs, which can range from $15,000 to around $100,000, Level 2 charging makes the most fiscal sense for budget planning. Now, I'm sure you've wondered about the substantial swings in that cost, and there's an explanation. The cost to install EVSE is contingent on what stands in the way. That's why it's so important to incorporate EVSE in due construction. To maximize the cost benefits, you need to plan ahead. Here are some strategies to consider. Lead by example. When evaluating your light-duty fleets, encourage EV procurement. With low to no maintenance and fuel costs due to those simpler and cleaner drivetrains, the cost of EV ownership can be less than gasoline vehicles. And check out the state contract. Municipalities can purchase alternative fuel vehicles such as EVs and other fuel-efficient vehicles from our contract. New contracts are usually published in the late fall and early winter, that time frame, so stay tuned. It should be coming out very soon. Install charging stations in your municipal parking lots and town facilities. This also offers a solution to your condo and rental community and can give you access to charging data for future planning. Encourage schools to offer staff and student charging and to be aware of electric school bus pilots and funding opportunities, such as EPA's DERA and school bus rebate programs. That's that Diesel Emissions Reduction Act program by EPA. In fact, there is currently an open round of DERA funding that's being administered by DES through the New Hampshire Clean Diesel Grant Program. So please reach out to me if that's something that you'd like more information about. Also consider electrification options for medium and heavy duty transit fleets. The challenges of range and cost in this sector are being met by improvements in battery capacity and charging technology, along with manufacturer competition and decreasing battery costs. Become an EV hotspot. Identify strategically placed destinations for charging stations like popular restaurants, shops, and hotels that can attract tourism and draw in business to your main streets and town centers. Charging an EV is a different experience than fueling a car at a gas station. So rather than waiting until the fuel gauge is near empty, EV drivers often take advantage of opportunities to top off. Now, while it takes longer to charge your car with electricity, it can be accomplished while you're doing something else. As you know, per the fire marshal, you cannot leave gas pumps unattended when fuel is being dispensed. When charging an EV, you simply plug in and go about your business. Public charging can provide a boost to local businesses because EV drivers often seek out stations they can use while enjoying a cup of coffee, dining, or shopping nearby. So in this next segment on planning and permitting, we'll dive into this a bit more, but I just want to call out the overarching considerations. Since local municipal governments and code enforcement officials are the authorities over planning and permitting EV charging stations, consider adopting EV-friendly zoning, parking ordinances, and building codes to encourage charging stations or the electrical infrastructure in new construction and parking lot renovations. It's certainly less expensive to install that wiring and conduit up front than it is after the fact. Encourage builders to consider EVSE when they're pulling permits for residential, commercial, and multi-unit dwellings. Adopt EV-friendly permitting and inspection processes to make it simple and easy for residential and commercial charging stations. Maybe suggest to those station developers when they're pulling those permits to consider EVSE. So choosing a site for DC fast charging is resource intensive. When selecting a site, a station developer has to consider many factors, such as local traffic patterns, EV adoption in surrounding areas, proximity to major roadways and nearby services, safety and appropriate lighting. Station developers also need to work with electric utilities to ensure adequate electrical infrastructure to accommodate DC fast charging. Available grid connections and electrical capacity may also limit charger placement at a site. Sometimes easements from utilities and others are needed, which can add additional time and cost to securing a site and place restrictions on where the charger can be located. Lastly, the station developer and site host need to enter into a contract, which often restricts or dictates that specific on-site location of the chargers. So it's important to keep in mind that station developers must complete this resource-intensive process for siting DC fast charging stations even before a permit application is submitted. Therefore, the clearer the permitting requirements are up front, the better equipped the applicant is to submit what you're looking for the first time around. So there are several different characteristics that differentiate gas stations from DC fast charging stations. The most obvious difference is that one involves gas, a toxic substance that can cause environmental harm when spilled or leaked and emits fumes that are hazardous to breathe, while the other uses electricity. Now, when gas stations that are open to the public are developed, they typically include a convenience store, which requires HVAC and plumbing equipment, and gas pumps, which require storage tanks and fire suppression systems. In addition, gas stations and their associated stores are normally standalone enterprises. On the other hand, as of now, DC fast charging stations are usually added to existing developments as an accessory use, and they can be installed in a variety of locations, including convenience stores, rest stops, malls, etc. Also, DC fast charging stations do not require storage tanks to store fuel. So while there's many other differences that can be mentioned, the point is that gas stations should not be used as a blueprint for how to permit DC fast charging stations. So there are billions of dollars of planned investment in electric vehicle charging equipment from electric utilities, states, and private EVSE companies. Therefore, municipalities will likely see more applications for EV charging stations in the coming months and years. Although municipalities may have experienced permitting residential and commercial level 2 charging, New Hampshire does not have a state standard. We don't regulate from the state level. This is a town-by-town decision, meaning that each town has their own electrical permit and process. This can be challenging for EV charging station installers and electricians to navigate. For example, some towns have an electrician's license number entered on the form. Some require a copy of the actual license, and others require the master electrician to apply in person with their license and a driver's license to prove their identity. Note that requiring the master electrician to be there is an additional expense to that site host. However, with a structured and well-defined permitting process, these types of issues can easily be overcome. To the extent that communities could adopt similar permitting requirements, especially for that straightforward level 2 charging, the easier it would be for a station developer to navigate the process, and the more likely the investment will be made in your community. Now, I'd like to invite Barry to provide some input here on this slide.
Thanks, Jess. Appreciate those comments about simplification and transparency, which I think are the two biggest issues that we would like to reinforce here for every municipality. I mean, I think that the likelihood is that there certainly will be DC fast charging stations, you know, throughout New Hampshire, but it's more likely that there'll be level 2 type stations in your community, which is actually good news because they're a relatively simple, you know, relatively simple type technology. But one thing that's been identified, and I was going to point out, this is from the Rocky Mountain Institute, a study on reducing EV charging infrastructure costs that's available online. But what they identified, that the soft cost element as being one of those variables that can be a very significant additional cost to developers. And I think so I think it's important for towns to recognize the role that they play in adding to that complexity. And I think the other thing that I would reiterate is that, you know, while it's true, particularly for DC fast chargers, the amount of work that goes in up front in identifying the site hosts, and in fact, that's probably the single biggest challenge right now, is getting folks, you know, who are willing, you know, to provide the dedicated parking and additional resources. It's still an issue even for level 2 host sites, you know, to get them involved and engaged. And the last thing that developers and EV charging folks need to have is additional soft cost, you know, obstacles to prevent the development of the project. So thanks, Jess.
Thank you, Barry. Excellent. So at this point, I'd love to go ahead, Carl, if you could, and launch the second poll. And here we'd like to know if you've directly permitted or inspected EV charging installations in your community. I'll give everybody a few seconds here to go ahead and respond.
We've got about 9 of 30. So those of you out there, we've got a poll going now. If you could just respond to the poll. Not much change. Okay.
At the top, 26.
26 now. All right. Jess, you want me to?
Sure.
Yeah. Do I hit end polling? There we go.
Excellent. So it looks like the majority at this point know, but we've got a few that just may not know because they're not in the permitting or planning positions there, but 35% yes, so that's awesome. So we've got folks tuning in that obviously have experienced that. Thank you for letting us know. So according to EVSE providers, the permitting process for EV charging stations is sometimes lengthy and fraught with delays due to unfamiliarity with the technology, protracted zoning reviews, and undefined requirements for permitting. As a result, the permitting process can be resource intensive for both applicants and municipalities. In some extreme instances, station developers have actually withdrawn permit applications and found new charging station sites in neighboring towns, shifting that potential economic opportunity to other locations. Now, based on conversations with EVSE providers and by reviewing the practices and recommendations in leading municipalities, there are some clear steps that you can take to encourage EV charging station deployment and make that permitting process more efficient for everyone involved, from the zoning boards to permitting officials to station developers and inspectors. You could standardize the permit review and inspection process for EV charging stations. EVSE providers report that when required, zoning reviews are usually the lengthiest part of the approval process and are not always necessary. Often zoning reviews are unnecessary because EV charging stations are an accessory use to the principal use of that site. That is, EV charging stations are usually added to existing parking areas for already developed sites. In general, DC fast charging stations have a very limited impact on the locations where they're situated. They have little effect on area traffic, do not consume unnecessary space, and have a short window of operation per vehicle. Some municipalities find that amending their zoning ordinance to clarify that EV charging is an accessory use that does not require further zoning board approval, and to clearly identify any exceptions, can save time and resource for both zoning boards and applicants. The Seabrook town planner advised that they classify EVSE, both level 2 and DC fast charging, as an accessory use, which eliminates any extra reviews by the planning board. The City of Dover's site review regulations definition of EVSE explicitly states that it's permitted outright as an accessory use to any principal use. Municipalities can further streamline the review process by providing concurrent reviews for building, electric, and any other reviews necessary for the approval of a permit. It's also important to standardize the building electrical permit review and inspection process, and to make the grounds for rejecting a permit application clear up front. In addition, developing a concise step-by-step checklist for inspections sets clear expectations about what will be inspected, which documents must be brought to that inspection, and who should be present. During the inspection process, inspectors should ensure that that project is consistent with the issued permits and avoid adding any additional requirements at that point. Some municipalities also find that they can consolidate the number of required inspections for EV charging stations by conducting multiple inspections simultaneously. Bear, I'd like for you to join us here and let us know if you've got some thoughts to add.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, I think that besides the DC fast charge process here, I think this is relevant to all electric vehicle charging, the level 2s in particular. And I think a checklist is extremely important. I think we've only had one instance where we've had to go before a planning board, and that was for a single dual level 2 pedestal, which greatly increased the timing and so forth involved. So concurrent reviews, I think, are also really helpful. And I think for DC fast charging, to get the inspector out when the utility is there as well. I know this is kind of a novel area still for folks. And so I think the more that we can coordinate and have everybody at the site at the same time, I think would be a great use of everybody's time and expertise. But I was going to add that in terms of the complexity here, if you think about level 2s as being just another electrical appliance, which really they are. I mean, they're a 40 amp electrical appliance. They're a minor electrical component, and it's a 3-wire type configuration, single phase configuration, which means that there really ought not to be any excessive requirements if we treat them like a minor electrical component.
Very good, thank you. That's a good insight. So try making the permitting process, the process for permitting EV charging stations clear and transparent. As a first step, clearly identify required application materials, where to find the permit application, permitting steps and associated timelines, any fees involved, and points of contact. Fact sheets are a convenient way to convey this information. Some municipalities even have a permit application specifically for EV charging that addresses both level 2 charging and DC fast charging. Prominently featuring these permits and fact sheets online makes it easy for station developers to locate this information, and will reduce the time that staff spends responding to these questions and dealing with incomplete applications. Barry, go ahead and join us for some thoughts here.
Yeah, so I think, in this age of COVID, I think we've all learned that virtual reality is actually a workable solution, and the more information that can be based on websites, I think the better. And I think we all recognize that it's possible to get stuff done now remotely in ways that we may not have thought previously. I was going to say one thing on fees here. I've seen nationally, just for example, in the residential installation market, the cost of fees can be anywhere from $0 to $600 for permitting, like in the LA County for just residential, a single charger. We typically, I think, factor in 1 to 1.5% of overall project cost for the permitting fees, but that's really kind of a shot in the dark because there's so much variability. So I think any of that information is really important up front to get an understanding. And I think I gave you a sense of what the project cost can be, but there's high variability. We've done level 2 clusters right now as large as 18 ports for a ski area, Okemo, in Vermont, and that's uncommon. I think the most common one is going to be 4 ports, So that's about a 160 amp system. So, you know, I think fees need to reflect the reality of what the project costs and the complexity, you know, may be. You know, DC fast charging obviously is a little bit of a different animal because of the size of the amperages and the overall project cost. But for level twos, you know, on the permitting process transparency side, I would try to be really clear about fees up front. It'll help everybody's understanding of what's needed. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So consider offering options to submit permit applications electronically. As Barry mentioned, now during this time of COVID, this is a particularly pertinent opportunity to maybe transition those permit applications to maybe an online form. Ideally, if possible, in a fillable PDF application that accepts electronic signatures and allows that permit application to be submitted online or even via email, which would make it easier for station developers to submit applications and much safer for permitting staff to receive and process them. There are some online permitting applications that can also assist with internal reviews and even communicate externally about the status of the review. So online permitting, or providing that option to obtain applications online and submit them via email if online permitting is not available, would allow the applicant to avoid unnecessary trips and associated greenhouse gas emissions to the permitting office and cut down at lines on the permit counter. You might also amend local ordinances to count parking spaces for EV charging toward minimum parking requirements. Now, in some locations, minimum parking requirements are a barrier to siting charging stations because EV charging spaces are not counted as parking spaces. This can make it more difficult for station developers to find a site host. Municipalities can address this issue by updating local ordinances to clarify that spaces for EV charging count towards meeting minimum parking space requirements. Some municipalities are incentivizing the deployment of charging stations doing this. For example, adopting ordinances that count charging station spaces as more than one parking space for zoning purposes. Per the City of Dover's site review regulations, the paved area fee, the application fee, is cut in half. It's reduced by 50% if at least 2% of the parking spaces are for EV charging stations. And they've also made an exception to their maximum parking calculation when EV charging stations are included. The town of Seabrook is believed to be the only town in New Hampshire that completely did away with minimum parking requirements altogether, removing it from their zoning ordinance and the site plan review regulations. Barry, I'd love for you to join us again and give us some thoughts here.
Yeah, I think it's really important to count them as parking spaces. I mean, this picture shows DC fast chargers that are kind of out in the lot, which is a design that you do see, but it's certainly not required that the cabinets be out in the parking areas. I mean, a lot of them can be set off in existing softscape or in front of, at the head of parking and so forth. But I think it's important to be thinking about incentivizing developers who make the commitment to put charging in. And I think it's also important for states like New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont, you know, rural New England states, to be aware that there's going to be increasing pressure for putting charging in, you know, irrespective of the deployment rates of their population base, because we've got a huge tourism, you know, community which comes up in all seasons at this point, and a lot of them are southern New England, where we're seeing much larger deployments of the vehicles. So the idea of providing parking, you know, for public lots, et cetera, I think is really important going forward. I don't know that it's required that the chargers conform to ADA. I think that there's, I think that a lot out of prudence, I think a lot of the network providers do require that there be some level of ADA built into the design, but it's not on a national level, to my knowledge, required. But it is important to be thinking about, you know, allowing for parking. And the last comment I would make is we're starting to see states and municipalities require a certain percentage of parking spaces be some level of electrified. So I think of Boston, which has a 25% of all new public parking lots have electrification, you know, is probably one of the more aggressive examples. So it's something it's coming, obviously, you know, as the vehicles deploy in greater and greater numbers. Thanks.
Good point. Thank you. Also consider developing expertise and sharing knowledge with station developers and other municipalities. COVID-19 restrictions notwithstanding, it would be a good idea to offer pre-permit application meetings or reviews during the siting phase for EV charging stations, especially for complex projects. This would allow the permitting staff and station developers to learn from one another, and also provides an opportunity for staff to become familiar with the proposed project and identify any potential issues for those station developers to consider. In addition, large municipalities may benefit from developing in-house expertise and designating an EVSE expert who is the point person on EVSE permit applications. And lastly, it can be useful for municipal staff to coordinate with neighboring municipalities to share best practices. Exchanging ideas, sharing resources, and creating some consistency across the region will ultimately improve the process for both municipalities and station developers. Barry, what are your thoughts here?
Oh, well, I think I think it'd be great if every municipality had an EV expert. That's probably not practical, but you know, certainly as time goes on, larger municipalities are going to find that that would, I think, be a tremendous asset to have. The one comment I was going to make, I mean, there's tons of resources out there in terms of how to get educated, but there's one that I found that actually is a Clean Cities product called the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program. That's a mouthful, but it was designed for electricians as far as they're getting credentialed at IBW training facilities. So it's a fairly, it could be a fairly involved process, but I think you can streamline it and take different modules. But that's one to keep in mind. I mean, it focuses on the market, it focuses on the National Electric Code Section 625, which, you know, relates to EV charging installations and so forth. So that might be one resource to help, you know, accelerate your education in this area. Thanks.
Great. Actually, Barry, stay on. So now for more on the installer perspective, Barry's going to provide a wrap up from his perspective. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, the one comment I was going to make is that municipalities would be thinking along the lines of Boston, maybe not as aggressively, but in terms of creating some incentive for developers to start to incorporate into projects a certain level of electrification for vehicle parking. And that doesn't have to be that complicated. I mean, it could be just upgrading the existing electrical and maybe providing conduit, and it's been shown that if you plan ahead and incorporate, you know, some of the design elements needed, that it can save 65 to 75% of the installation costs. So much cheaper than having to go back and retrofit and you have to go back and review, you know, a system that originally may not have been designed quite as well to anticipate charging. So that's one thing. And then I'd reiterate, you're most likely going to find that the scale of charging you're going to deal with on a more regular basis is going to be level 2, and it's going to be maybe 4 ports, 4 parking spaces, and that's 160 amp total electrical requirement, which is a minor, should be considered to be a fairly minor electrical appliance. So the more you think about what you're going to encounter, the most frequently, I'd urge you to review what you have set up for processes to anticipate that. I think it's unusual for folks to do more than 4 charging ports at this stage. That doesn't mean that people wouldn't be thinking about expanding if they're in a particularly heavy use site, but the average site, I'd say, is going to be 2 to 4 ports out of the gate. And that's sort of the scale that I think I'd be looking at, if I was, a municipality thinking in terms of the code and so forth. So other than that, I just would reiterate, I think this is a great slide presentation, and just reiterate the points that Jess made about, checklist, transparency, point of contact, anything to make it upfront easier to understand what the municipality requires, and is not, and not make it burdensome or throw obstacles in the way of the deployment, because the vehicles are coming. If you haven't driven one, you should, and you'll get a sense of why it is that we're here today, because, we're going to see rapid deployment over the next 5 years. So it's always good to get ahead of what we see coming in the future. Thank you.
Jess, Barry, we've
Great.
got a couple questions here. You want to get to them now or?
Yeah, actually, I was just going to mention, sure, we'd love to see some questions. And I just wanted to also real quickly just let you know, Granite State Clean Cities is here to help. Barry, Brian, these are all partners and stakeholders in this process. We're happy to facilitate conversations, connect you to resources. And certainly we're also curious to know if you see challenges with considering these suggestions. And so before we move on to the utility perspective, go ahead, Carl, let's hear some questions.
Sure. The first one was, what are some examples of towns in New Hampshire that have related zoning and site plan, as well as, or building permit requirements and incentives?
Can you repeat that? I think
Sure.
I think you either cut off a little bit in the beginning,
Yeah.
Carl. Go ahead.
Looking
Okay.
for examples of towns in New Hampshire that have related zoning and site plan, as well as building permit requirements, I assume associated with EV charging. And then also, are there
Okay.
incentives?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, Seabrook, the city of Dover, there's a few that I mentioned. I'm certainly happy to maybe follow up with some resources afterwards. I kind of combined everything into a nice little packet that I can share with folks if they're interested. So whoever is asking that questions, please shoot me an email. I can get you some examples for reference.
Yeah. The other thing I would add to that is, I think I'd be open to looking at what's happening in some other states, particularly California, that's probably got a 5-year lead on what the on the ground realities are for larger deployment of charging infrastructure. And I know I did a quick Google search in the last few days, and there's a ton of municipal code-based commentary for EV charging. So, I would be surprised if there's many New Hampshire-based towns that have addressed this issue, but that doesn't mean that there's not an answer out there. So I would look to the west, I think, a little bit for more practical feedback on that. So
The other question was, what are your thoughts on free charging versus charging? Cost per charging unit?
Yeah. So I get this. I'll jump in, Jess. I answered this question.
Go ahead.
I answered this question a lot, and I think the way of the world is going to be that it's going to be smart charging networked, where people will pay for use of the charger and for the electricity. I don't know. I think that the issue that we have in northern New England right now is utilization rates, because the smart charging technology and the ongoing fees are definitely higher than a basic charger, which a basic charger is basically, it's a plug and play type situation where there's not an easy way to recover the cost of the electricity. But think about it this way: the electricity is probably about $1 an hour for level 2, and so it's not like gasoline in terms of cost equivalency. So my standard thought is that the installation is the same, whether it's basic or smart charging. You need to look at the site to see what the existing utilization or what the near-term utilization rates look like. And it may be reasonable to put in a basic charger now, knowing that in 4 years or less, that the utilization and the cost of that free electricity is going to be, higher than anticipated, and you can switch it out and put in smart charging at that point. So I think it's kind of unfortunately, it's it depends kind of answer, but I think I would look at the utilization rates of the particular site to provide guidance on the economics, given the difference in the costs between the two.
That's it for questions right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Barry. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brian Morris for the utility perspective.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Let me just see if I can share my screen and do it right. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Great, so good morning, folks. Thank you all for joining today. So I'm gonna start off with a very quick high-level overview of who EverSource is for folks that don't know the company. I'll then talk specifically about an EV charging station installation program that we're currently deploying in Massachusetts. So I'll give an overview there and talk about what some typical installation scenarios look like in terms of the infrastructure required. I'll then get into some things that site hosts should be considering when planning for good locations for this infrastructure. And then I think what I'm seeing a lot more of is our customers that are looking at including EV charging as part of a much broader sustainability strategy. And so we're seeing folks integrating EV charging with different technologies. And so I'll give a little bit of guidance as to when folks should really pull the utility into those conversations to make sure we're all aligned and coordinated. So Eversource at a glance, we're the largest energy company in New England. We provide electric, natural gas, and water services to about 4 million customers throughout Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Our top priority, obviously, is to provide safe, reliable, and affordable services to our customers. But one thing that we're really becoming increasingly invested in is helping our states to transition to a much cleaner energy future, right? So the region and the country really has some pretty aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And so how do we as a utility company help that transition? So things like investing in offshore wind, energy storage, continuing in our industry-leading energy efficiency programs. And transportation electrification is a key part of that strategy. So how do we help to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles by customers in the communities that we serve? And so if you look across the country, and you think about why don't more people drive electric vehicles? One of the key barriers to adoption today is the lack of public charging infrastructure. So if you get in your car and if you go for a drive right now, you'll likely find a ton of gas stations, but not quite the proliferation of EV charging stations. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is they're not necessarily cheap to install. And it's not just the cost of the hardware and the software that Barry discussed, but it's the infrastructure required to support the fueling of that charging station. So what are we doing at Eversource? We've been deploying since 2018 a $45 million capital program where we are funding the electrical infrastructure from the service drop of the utility supply up to the pad that the charging station itself sits on. So Eversource pays for that. The site host pays for the charging station, the installation of the charging station, and the ongoing operation and maintenance fees associated with that charging station. A couple of some key program metrics that we're targeting. So 3,500 charging ports electrified with 10% of total investment going towards disadvantaged communities. I can say that 3 years into the program, we are fully subscribed, meaning that all the money is currently accounted for, and we're on track to meet or exceed both of those targets. So we think it's a really good story when it comes to really trying to increase the availability of publicly available charging infrastructure in our service territories. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide because Jessica covered it very well, but our program supports the deployment of 2 different types of charging stations, level 2 and DC fast. Level 2 is lower capacity charging. Depending on the battery size in the vehicle, it can support fueling the vehicle in anywhere from 4 to 6 hours typically. So you want to put these things in locations where folks tend to spend longer periods of time. So workplaces are great applications, colleges, apartment complexes where people live but don't have access to in-garage charging. Those are good applications for level 2 siting. And then DC fast chargers, so Jessica mentioned, today 50 kilowatts is kind of the standard. That can charge a vehicle in anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. We're seeing more and more 150 kW and up to 350 and above kW as the battery sizes and vehicles get bigger and as folks start to demand quicker charging times. So you want to put these in places where folks don't tend to spend as much time, like rest stops and off exit along major travel corridors where somebody can pop off, get a quick bite to eat, grab something in a convenience store, and then be on their way. So our program that I mentioned in Massachusetts supports both of these different types of charging station infrastructure applications. So I call this a typical installation scenario. I want to be careful here. There really isn't a typical installation because they're very site specific. A lot of site specific conditions and characteristics change what infrastructure is needed. but this is an example of what a scenario might look like. So you've got a parking lot here, a small parking lot. You've got the Eversource supply pole bringing service to the parking lot. Off to the right, you have a white control box, and I'll talk in a minute about what that control box is. But basically, it's where the panel sits, and there's a meter socket attached to the side as well that you can see. And then off to the left, you see the actual charging station protected by bollards. But I think this is probably a more compelling and interesting view of what's happening under the ground at that same location. This is a bit of a different angle, but if you kind of twist this around, it's the same parking lot that we were just looking at. So you've got the Eversource supply pole bringing service to the site. You've got conduit running from that supply pole up to this control box. This control box is protected by bollards so that snowplows and cars don't accidentally knock it over or damage it. You've got some more conduit running out from the control box to a handhole, and then a conduit running from the handhole out to the charging station. I didn't mention, but for our Massachusetts program, we've really kind of standardized around one use case for level 2 charging. And that is that if the customer agrees to purchase one dual port charging station, we'll supply the infrastructure required to electrify up to 10 charging ports. And the reason for that is really around future expansion. So a lot of the cost in these installations is the trenching work and running the conduit underground. It makes sense from our standpoint, if we're already going to be digging into the ground to put in conduit to support one dual port charging station, why not put in more to allow for future growth if the customer decides to buy additional charging stations as the market continues to evolve? Barry's point is well taken that today, certainly 2 ports or 4 ports seems to be kind of the number, but we're hoping that as the number of EVs on the road continues to increase, we'll need more, and customers will want to purchase more charging stations, and so they'll have the infrastructure where they can just go plop a pad down, plop a charging station down, and have the infrastructure underground to support fueling those charging stations. So I mentioned this control box. This control box is something we're pretty proud of. The standardization has allowed us to really cost effectively and quickly deploy these sites. So what is it? It's UL listed NEMA enclosure, dual disconnects for utility and firefighters. So if first responders show up and have to de-energize the site for whatever reason, they can do that. There's also individual disconnects for each individual charging station. So you don't have to take the whole bank of charging stations down if one of them is having operational issues. Cold sequence metering throughout the entire Eversource service territory. And then safety is a key concern too. So dead front lockable, tamper-proof enclosures. The key here is if you're thinking about, especially when you're putting these things in parks and schools, you want to make sure that children can't intentionally or accidentally access what could be potentially dangerous equipment if they're able to get in. So again, very proud of this equipment. And the standardization of this has allowed us to really quickly stand up the projects that we're deploying throughout our service territory. A few examples of some things that folks that are looking to put in charging stations should consider. So as Jessica mentioned, EV charging stations are not classified as filling stations, and so the requirements are different in terms of what regulatory things that those locations have to abide by. Historical districts. So an example I'll give here from our Mass program is there was a town that was in a historical district, and there was a proposal to put in some charging stations that had an LCD screen paywall. The town shut it down because they wanted to maintain the look and feel of the historical district, and so a different solution had to be found to meet the needs of the commissioners that didn't want that LCD screen interfering with the look of the rest of the town. Metering. This is a really key thing here. So as part of our Massachusetts program, we require all charging stations to be a separately metered service. And there's 2 reasons for that in the program, and then a third that I'll mention too that I think goes to all potential deployments. So in the program, the Mass Department of Public Utilities wanted us to separately meter these for 2 reasons. One is to the extent that we're continuously looking at the potential of developing EV-specific time of use rates, any EV-specific rate solution in general For a charging station or bank of charging stations that take service under that rate, they'd have to be separately metered. And also from a data collection standpoint, we know that charging stations themselves, smart charging stations, can capture a lot of good data, but it's good to have that second data source of the meter to understand how those charging stations are being utilized to help inform future program decisions and future rate design decisions. You don't need to separately meter charging stations. You can connect them right up to the building panel if there is existing capacity. One concern is that, you know, if even though there could be capacity today for 2 or 4 ports, if you decide to put them more down the road, you could be looking at expensive panel upgrades, including switchgear. That could have been avoided if there had been a separately metered second service brought in just for the charging stations that could have been sized appropriately to avoid future rework costs. So just a consideration. I know different towns and different states are in different kind of areas of the EV adoption curve. And so what makes sense for one site may not make sense for another, but just some things to consider. Then code considerations. I think Jessica mentioned that, you know, we do support kind of at least minimum make-ready requirements for new construction. So it is a lot cheaper to run conduit before a parking lot is poured, as opposed to having to go in, excavate that parking lot, trench, and then run that conduit after the fact. That can be expensive. So we certainly are supportive of those types of requirements. Boston, I think, has an ordinance where 25% of all new parking spaces have to be have EVSE installed, with the remaining 75% be made ready, if you will, for future EV charging stations that could be installed down the road. So I mentioned that, you know, EV charging we're starting to see as part of some of our customers' broader sustainability goals. So one example I'll give here is this is the picture here you're looking at is of a school, a new school that was built. So there was a proposal to bring a new secondary service on board to support that school. They also had an interest in installing solar canopies, which you can see. So that was going to be a second proposed secondary service. And they wanted to enroll in the Make Ready program for EV charging, which was going to be a proposed third secondary service. A wire inspector came in and said, hold on a second, guys, there has to be a better way to do this. Let's kind of rethink this. And so the point is that, you know, the earlier that our customers come to us or their respective utility company, the better. Bring us to the table, involve us in the conversations. We can help to avoid potentially costly and time-consuming rework. And I think most of our customers have, you know, an assigned Eversource account executive. If you don't, feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you with the right people. But again, bring us to the table, involve us in the conversations to make sure that we're all aligned and coordinated to make these deployments as cost-effective and as efficient as possible. And that is what I have, Jessica, for prepared remarks. So I will kick it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian, for the utility perspective. And Barry, if you want to invite you to come back on as well, we're happy to take any questions from our attendees today, or to hear any conversation if you have any thoughts or anything that you'd like to share. I think, Carl, did you mention that folks can unmute themselves as well, or raise their hand and be unmuted if they'd like to share something?
That's right. Yeah, feel free to. I think I need to track who's raising their hands here, but nope, nobody.
We'll give folks a couple of nobody has anything in the chat at this point.
In the chat, no, it's just been one suggestion to everyone. You could let your board know that the units in Derry, this is from Elizabeth, municipal water are utilized daily. She's got a charge. I've used it with my electric car. There's a public charger in the Derry municipal lot in Derry, New Hampshire. That's it, though.
Excellent. Excellent.
I had a question for.
Go ahead.
I had a question for Brian. In Mass, I know that some of the other states have started to pass laws that have essentially charging station. It's like a charging station bill of rights for condo owners and, you know, multi-unit dwelling type situations where there may be resistance to allowing one person, you know, put in a charger. And these statutes essentially, you know, prevent obstruction by board decisions and so forth. Is that something that you've encountered at all, Brian, in Mass or some of the markets that you're involved in?
That's a great point, Barry. So multi-unit dwellings are typically, they're really challenging deployments across the country because the issue of you've got the landlord, you've got the individual at a condo or an apartment who may own an EV, but may not have assigned parking. And so, yes, there are, what we're seeing, which we think is great, is requirements that folks that have a condo not be precluded from being able to install a charging station. And so we are seeing more of that. We've actually had a lot of success, kind of unexpectedly, because, you know, our program was one of the first moving programs outside of California. And so we leaned heavily on California development and how they were deploying their program. And we had heard a lot about really challenging situations with multi-unit dwellings. We're seeing a lot of uptake in our program with multi-unit dwellings. So I think that's a pretty good sign that I think a lot of landlords and folks that own those locations are hearing from the folks in their communities that they want these things, they need these things. And so that's one of the success stories that I think that I'm not sure we were anticipating, but so far we haven't had as many challenges with multi-unit dwellings as I think we anticipated at the onset of the program.
I noticed in one of the chat comments about how the local board doesn't feel like New Hampshire's, you know, needs to be thinking too much along transportation electrification and you know, and I mean, that's a relative awareness that's going to increase, but I was going to just suggest that it's really important for all of us to spread, I think, the word about what's coming. Maine last week, as part of its Maine Climate Action Plan, approved a goal of 41,000 plugins by 2025 as a state level goal. So, you know, more and more states are realizing that this is not a flash in the pan technology. This is where it's coming. And we're seeing, you know, medium duty, heavy duty, you know, like you alluded to, Jess, with the transit buses and so forth. I mean, we're starting to see transition to electricity for all types of transportation platforms. So it's something that's coming. And if there's a way for any of us to help educate, you know, town boards and so forth, I think it's really important for them to understand, you know, at what level this transition is and where it's going.
And if I could add to that, Barry, too. So I think, you know, I know that New Hampshire doesn't have any EV adoption specific goals like some other neighboring states do. Obviously, tourism is a huge industry for the state of New Hampshire. If you look at surrounding states, so Jessica mentioned Massachusetts has a goal of 300,000 EVs in the road by 2025. Connecticut has a goal of 125 to 150,000 EVs by 2025. And so these are all neighboring states, other states in the region too, that are traveling to and through New Hampshire that really need the ability to charge. Really, and that's a specific application for DC fast charging, right? Where you have these travel corridors that support folks that are traveling to and from the state. So I would caution folks not just to look at how many EVs are on the road in the state, but to look at other states that are coming in to support that tourism industry that also need to be able to charge in increasing amounts as EV adoption increases in those states. So just another consideration.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Carl, why don't we go ahead and launch our third poll. Here we'd like to know how applicable is the information that we provided in this training today towards the permitting process for electric vehicle charging stations in your town or city.
There we go. Everybody see the poll? Okay, here we go. Almost there. Anybody else want to complete the poll? All right. Looks like we're stuck at this number. I'll end the polling. There's the results.
Great to see. 64% very applicable. That's great to hear. 32% somewhat applicable. And for those that answered that way and not applicable, reach out to me. I'm happy to, like I said, share your questions with my stakeholders that are engaged in this space. You know, we can get your questions answered. We can certainly get information to you. So appreciate that response. And Carl, why don't we go ahead and launch our fourth poll? How do you intend to use this information that you learned today?
All right, the poll's out there. All right, about half of you have answered. Okay, a few more seconds. Anybody wants to finish the poll? Okay, last chance. It looks like we're stuck at this number. And there are the results.
Great. So it looks like about 14% planning to work on streamlining that permitting process. I know not everybody has the authority to do that. For those of you that do, I'm glad to see that you're engaged in doing that. 50% planning to speak to those who do have that authority to streamline the permitting process. So this is great. You know, like Barry and Brian have both said, you know, this information shouldn't stop here, right? We need to keep spreading the word about what's happening with electric vehicles and the opportunities that we have to take advantage of to make this process smoother for our own state and to invite this investment here. 36% continuing to gather information, and that's good too. I know, you know, there's a lot of questions. This is rapidly changing technology, so certainly do your due diligence and know that we are here as a resource. I think all of us are happy to say that we're open to taking any follow-up questions or inquiries, and we'll certainly try to get you connected to good information. Carl, any further questions in the chat or any other questions from folks out there?
I don't have any additional questions in the chat, but if anybody has questions at this point, this would be a great time.
Sure. And maybe I'll just also mention, you know, there's a lot of tools out there to help municipalities that are interested in planning and, you know, looking at what may be necessary in their community. A couple in particular, one, the EVI ProLight tool, which you can find on the Alternative Fuel Data Center, does help you to kind of estimate how much charging you might need for your specific, you know, space, for how many drivers you might have in your town or city. There's also an MJ Bradley tool that helps you identify great locations. And as I mentioned, those corridors that New Hampshire has designated are a good place to be looking at, you know, siting for EV charging. Barry or Brian, do you have any thoughts on good resources for folks that you might want to pass along just based on your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think Plug in America website, I'll mention them as another source of sort of general information that's been helpful. I like the US DOE website quite a bit. I haven't been on Eversource's website lately, Brian, but I assume you guys have a fair amount of information.
We do. We've got a lot of information on there. I would also say all those sources you guys mentioned are good. The one that I would add, maybe the AFTC has a tool where you can go on and find out how many charging stations there are, what types of charging stations there are in the different states, who are the manufacturers and so forth. And you can do an extract and take a look at that. So another good tool. But yeah, our website has, for our mass program, tons of information. We have an EV specific rate in Connecticut that you can find information on as well. Definitely some good stuff to check out there if you haven't already.
The other thing I would say is there's a Drive Electric New Hampshire group through Clean Energy New Hampshire that meets quarterly. And they, I think, have a really broad-based range of stakeholders, including utilities and folks involved in providing the construction services, et cetera, but also auto dealers and a pretty broad-based group that's New Hampshire centric. So if you really want to, you know, engage in the state-based efforts, that would be a good place to start.
Great. And I'm just going to share one other resource as well here. Bear with me. So there is also a report out there on evaluating electric vehicle infrastructure in New Hampshire. And this was a report led by Pete O'Connor from Plug in America, amongst other stakeholders as well, that put this together. A good resource for you if you're interested in kind of seeing some nuggets of information that they were able to glean specific to New Hampshire. So go ahead and check that out as well. I think we're coming close to what we wanted to share with you all today. We're at 9:26. Barry or Brian, I invite you to add anything, any other thoughts or anything that you'd like to say to the audience before we shut things down, maybe give them back a few minutes for their morning.
Well, I just say thanks for letting me share the virtual stage with Carl, Brian, you, Jess. I would just urge you to get in one of these vehicles and give it a test drive if you really want to know what's coming and why this is an important area.
Yeah, I would echo the thank you to Jessica for coordinating all this. I think it's been very helpful. Hopefully it's been helpful to you folks that have been listening in. What I would say is that I am one of, Eversource has, I would say, about 4 people that are dedicated somehow to the EV space. And so please feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you to the right people. Any questions, don't hesitate to, and Jessica, I'm not sure if we can get the contact information out there, but happy to take phone calls, emails, whatever I can do to help assist in the transition. But thank you to you all for taking the time this morning to call in.
Definitely. So I guess for me, closing remarks, you've heard the adage, it's better to be proactive than reactive. You have the power in decision-making and planning to charge ahead. I know it's a cliche, but charge ahead and meet the EV future on even ground, preferably with conduit running through it. Again, I thank you all again for your time. I do want to say we'll probably shoot you a follow-up email. I'm hoping to get everybody an email out. We want to know, what can we do to improve this training? What more do you need to move forward with your efforts in your communities? Please reach out to us. It's important for us to kind of hear, for the development of our programs, to hear what we can do better to support you. So that's what we're here to do. And thank you again so much to all of the presenters. You guys were fabulous. Carl, thank you to you and Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission for hosting this. We look forward to connecting with you again down the road. Thanks so much.
Couple things just to add. The video will be edited and available at snhpc.org. As well as on our YouTube channel. And Jess, I'll share it with you, and you guys can publish it wherever you like.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks,
Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.